There's a certain type of silence that hangs in the air just before your life changes forever. You know, the kind that hums around you, teasing you with the knowledge that something isn't right. I hadn't felt that kind of silence in years, but that night as Jessica, my wife of 14 years, gathered her things to work late at the office, it wrapped around me like a shroud. Jessica was radiant. Always had been. She had that effortless beauty that didn't need much makeup, though she'd dab on just enough to look polished. That night, however, there was something different. Her hair was styled in soft waves, perfect, almost too perfect. Her lipstick was a shade of red that I hadn't seen in years, not since the early days of our relationship when she'd dress up just for me. "Don't wait up," she said, her voice casual, but not casual enough. "Another late night?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light, though my stomach churned. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she fiddled with the clasp of her purse. "Yeah, Mark's really pushing us to finalize this project before the big client meeting. You know how it is." Mark, her boss. The name left a sour taste in my mouth. He'd always been too charming, too polished, too eager to make jokes at other men's expense, especially mine. I didn't like him, and I didn't trust him. But Jessica had insisted he was harmless. "He's like that with everyone," she'd say. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile that felt like it might crack my face. "Don't work too hard." She kissed me on the cheek, a peck, not the lingering kind we used to share, and left. As the front door clicked shut, the silence grew heavier, thicker. I glanced at the clock. 7:03 p.m. I wanted to believe her. 14 years of marriage, a beautiful home, a life we'd built brick by brick. It wasn't the kind of thing you threw away for something so fleeting. But lately, there had been cracks. Small ones at first. Missed dinners, forgotten conversations, an unfamiliar scent on her clothes. Nothing concrete, just a creeping sense of unease. And then there was the lingerie. A week ago, I found a receipt tucked in her purse while looking for a pen. A $300 set of lingerie, the kind she hadn't worn for me in years. She claimed it was for herself, to feel confident, she'd said. But something about the way she avoided my eyes made the excuse feel hollow. That night, I poured a whiskey and stared at her empty side of the bed, replaying the last few months in my head. The way she'd become distant. The way her phone seemed glued to her hand, always tilted just out of my view. And Mark, that smirk he gave me at the company dinner last month, when Jessica laughed just a little too hard at his joke. I didn't want to believe it, but the pieces were falling into place. And as much as it tore me apart to think of her betraying me, I needed to know the truth. I grabbed my laptop, opened a browser, and started searching. If she was hiding something, I'd find it. The first search was just a shot in the dark. How to track suspicious activity in a relationship. It felt ridiculous, like I was the insecure husband in some low-budget crime drama. But as I skimmed through forums and articles, my gut tightened. Story after story mirrored my own. A spouse growing distant, unexplained absences, secretive behavior. I didn't want to go full-on paranoid. Not yet. But I also couldn't sit idly by, drowning in my doubts. I had to know. A few clicks later, I ordered a couple of discreet cameras and an audio recorder. It felt underhanded, even wrong, but the thought of confronting her without proof made my stomach churn. 2 days later, a package arrived. The equipment was smaller than I'd imagined, the kind of stuff you'd see in a spy movie. I held one of the tiny cameras in my hand, marveling at how easily it could disappear into the corner of a room. For a moment, I hesitated. Was I really about to invade my wife's privacy? Then I remembered the red lipstick, the lingerie, the way Mark had looked at her like she was already his. Yes, I was. That evening, I waited until Jessica was in the shower. I slipped into our bedroom and began setting up the cameras. One in the smoke detector, another nestled discreetly among the books on her side of the bed. I even managed to hide a third in the living room, behind a decorative vase she'd bought last year. The audio recorder was trickier. I debated putting it in her purse but decided against it, too risky. Instead, I slid it under the driver's seat of her car, praying she wouldn't notice. When I was done, I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the blank wall ahead of me. I felt dirty. Guilty. This wasn't me. I wasn't the guy who spied on his wife. But then, I wasn't the guy whose wife came home late smelling like someone else's cologne either. For the next few days, I let the cameras do their work. Jessica didn't seem to notice anything out of the ordinary. She went about her routine, showering, dressing, heading to work. At first, everything seemed normal. Too normal. I began to wonder if I'd been wrong, if all of this was just my own insecurity eating me alive. And then one evening I saw it. It was just a brief moment, a flicker of something I wasn't supposed to see. Jessica had come home late, again, and she didn't bother with her usual excuses. Instead, she grabbed a glass of wine and sank onto the couch, pulling out her phone. I watched the footage later that night, fast-forwarding through hours of nothing until I saw her face light up with a smile. Not just any smile, a smile that belonged to someone in love. She was texting. Her fingers moved quickly, her face glowing in the dim light of the living room. She bit her lip, laughed softly, then typed something else. My chest tightened as I zoomed in on the screen. I couldn't see the name at the top, but I could make out part of the message. Can't wait until tomorrow. You're incredible. My blood ran cold. It could have been anyone, I told myself. A coworker, a friend, but deep down I knew better. The final nail came the next morning. I'd sync the audio recorder in her car to my phone and set it to alert me when it picked up any conversations. While I was at work, a notification popped up. My heart raced as I hit play. "Mark, stop," Jessica's voice said, laughing but not serious. "I can't keep doing this. If John finds out..." Silence. Then Mark's voice, low and smug. "He won't. You're too good at this. Besides, you deserve to have fun. I can't wait to see you tonight." I stared at the phone, the words echoing in my ears. She'd said my name. She'd said my name to another man while they planned their next meeting. That night, I didn't confront her. I didn't scream or cry or beg for answers. Instead, I sat quietly at the dinner table, watching her as she told me about her long day at work. Her words felt like knives, each one digging deeper into my chest. But I didn't flinch, because now I had what I needed, and I had a plan. The hardest part of that week wasn't gathering evidence. It was acting like nothing had changed. Every word Jessica spoke, every glance she gave me, every time she kissed me goodnight, it felt like a cruel mockery. But I swallowed it all down. I had to. Confrontation wasn't the goal. Not yet. She'd lied to my face for months. She'd kissed me with the same lips that whispered sweet nothings to another man. And now, I was going to let her bury herself. The following evening, I reviewed the footage again, this time with fresh resolve. I caught more snippets of texts, playful emojis, suggestive phrases, and one line that nearly drove me to rip the screen off my laptop. "Last night was perfect. I don't think I've ever felt this alive." My stomach twisted. I paused the video and stared at her expression as she typed it. Soft, vulnerable, glowing. I'd seen that look before. It was the same look she used to give me. That was the moment something inside me snapped. It wasn't just anger. It wasn't just betrayal. It was a sharp, electric determination. She thought she'd won. She thought she could waltz through our marriage, balancing her lies and lust like some kind of circus act. But she didn't know who she was dealing with. I started planning in earnest that night. Revenge wasn't an impulse. It was a strategy. The first step was to learn everything. Not just the surface-level details, but the full extent of her betrayal. I needed to know the when, the where, the how. I pored over the recordings, the texts, and the video feeds. I even synced her cloned phone to a separate device, letting me see her messages and call logs in real time. It didn't take long to map out their affair. It had started 8 months ago. Business trips, late-night strategy sessions, even a weekend conference I now realized had been nothing more than a lover's retreat. Every detail was a dagger to the heart, but I kept going. I had to. Mark, the smug bastard, wasn't just her boss. He was her enabler. He lavished her with compliments, treated her like a queen, and made jokes at my expense. The recordings revealed it all. "How's the screw guy?" He'd chuckle, mocking my job selling industrial fasteners. "You deserve better than that." Jessica would laugh, a soft, flirty sound that once belonged to me. "He's sweet," she'd say, as if she were discussing an old dog she was tired of caring for. By the end of the week, I was drowning in the weight of it all. The betrayal was more than physical. It was emotional, moral, complete. She wasn't just cheating on me. She was rewriting the story of our life together, painting me as some clueless fool she'd outgrown. But here's the thing about underestimating someone. It always backfires. I spent hours crafting my next steps, ensuring every detail was airtight. This wasn't about blowing up her life in some dramatic confrontation. That would be too simple, too impulsive. No, I wanted her to feel the walls close in. I wanted her to see the life she'd built crumble from the inside out. By the weekend, the plan was in motion. On Saturday morning, Jessica was in the kitchen, scrolling through her phone with that infuriating smirk on her face. I walked in, calm and composed, and leaned against the counter. "Hey, babe," I said casually. "I've been thinking, let's take a weekend trip soon. Just the two of us." She looked up, startled. "Oh, I'm sure. That sounds nice," she said a little too quickly. Her eyes darted back to her phone. "Good," I said, smiling. "I think we need it." What she didn't know was that I wasn't planning a getaway. I was laying the groundwork for her world to implode. The final piece of my plan arrived that afternoon. I'd hired a private investigator, not to catch her in the act. I'd done that myself, but to gather damning evidence about Mark. As the managing partner of his firm, Mark had plenty of skeletons in his closet, and I intended to drag every single one of them into the light. By Monday morning, I had everything I needed: proof of their affair, a dossier on Mark's shady dealings, and a carefully constructed web of consequences that neither of them would see coming. I sat back, sipping my coffee as Jessica rushed out the door, late for work. She kissed me on the cheek, the way she always did, and promised she'd make it up to me that evening. I smiled as she left, already picturing the storm brewing on the horizon. The game had just begun. Monday evening, Jessica walked into the house with the same breezy demeanor she perfected over the past few months. Her hair was slightly tousled, her cheeks flushed, not the kind of glow you get from work stress. "Long day?" I asked, sipping my whiskey from the couch. She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Exhausting," she said, slipping off her heels. "Mark's been pushing everyone so hard. I'm just glad to be home." Her lies were so smooth now, polished from months of practice. I nodded, keeping my expression neutral. "Well, I've got a surprise for you," I said, leaning forward. Her eyebrows lifted. "Oh, I made reservations for us this Friday, at that little French place you love. Figured we could use a night out, just the two of us." Her smile faltered, but she recovered quickly. "That's sweet of you, John. But Friday, I think I might have to work late. Mark's got us gearing up for that big presentation next week." "Of course he does." "No problem," I said smoothly. "We can reschedule. But if something changes, let me know." She smiled, the kind of smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Will do." As soon as she turned her back, my jaw clenched. Her reaction wasn't just telling, it was confirmation. She planned to see him that night. That night, as she slept soundly beside me, I set the next part of my plan into motion. I sent an email to Mark's wife, Stella, the trophy wife he paraded around like a prize at every company event. I wasn't sure if she knew about his affair, but something told me she'd want to. I didn't give her all the details, just enough to pique her curiosity. "Hi, Stella. I think you deserve to know what's been going on behind closed doors." Attached are some photos and text that might explain why Mark has been working so late. The photos were damning. Screenshots of their text exchanges, pictures of Jessica leaning into him during their business dinners, and of course, the piece de resistance, a shot from one of my hidden cameras showing Mark sitting on our couch with Jessica's legs draped across his lap. I hit send and leaned back, imagining the fallout. The next day, I received a reply. Stella's response was short and icy. "Thank you for this. I'll handle it." I almost felt sorry for Mark. Almost. But that was just the beginning. While Stella was undoubtedly having a conversation with her husband about his extracurricular activities, I was busy planting seeds of chaos in their professional lives. Using the dossier my private investigator had compiled, I anonymously forwarded several pieces of evidence to Mark's firm. Fraudulent expense reports, shady deals, and misuse of company funds. Nothing that would implicate Jessica directly, but enough to paint Mark as a liability. The fallout was swift. By Wednesday afternoon, word had spread that Mark was under internal investigation. Jessica didn't mention it that evening, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers lingered over her phone as she texted furiously. By Thursday, she was unraveling. That night, as she poured herself a second glass of wine, I asked casually, "Everything okay at work? You seem distracted." She forced a laugh. "It's just stressful, you know? Big projects. Deadlines." "Right," I said, holding her gaze a little too long. "I'm sure you'll figure it out." She looked away, her cheeks coloring faintly. "Yeah, of course." That night, as she slipped into bed beside me, I stayed up late, watching the footage from my cameras. It was almost pathetic how quickly their relationship was crumbling under the weight of my traps. I saw her texting him, her messages growing more frantic as his replies became clipped and distant. By Friday morning, Mark was officially suspended pending further investigation. Jessica left the house early, claiming she needed to help out at the office. I didn't bother asking questions. I knew exactly where she was going, to console her lover as their little empire burned around them. But as she walked out the door, she didn't realize I'd taken my next step. I'd already scheduled a meeting with a divorce lawyer and filed the necessary paperwork. But I wasn't going to serve her just yet. No, I wanted her to feel the full weight of her decisions first. That evening, I received an email from Stella. It was short, but it was exactly what I needed to see. "He's out of the house. Thank you for giving me the truth. If you need anything, let me know." I smiled, imagining the scene at their home. And as Jessica walked through the door later that night, her face pale and drawn, I greeted her with a calm, measured smile. "How was work?" I asked. She hesitated, her eyes darting to mine. "Long," she said softly. "I think I'm going to turn in early." I nodded, watching her retreat up the stairs. She didn't know it yet, but her carefully constructed double life was crumbling. And soon, she'd realize that I wasn't just sitting idly by. The hook was set. Now it was time to reel her in. Friday night came and went without a word from Jessica. She stayed upstairs, locked in the bedroom, scrolling through her phone in near silence. I could imagine what she was seeing. Mark's world crashing down, her own precarious position teetering on the edge. By Saturday morning, the tension in the house was thick enough to cut with a knife. Jessica came downstairs wearing one of those everything-is-fine smiles, but I wasn't buying it. I could see the cracks in her armor. "You okay?" I asked, casually flipping through the newspaper. "Yeah, just tired," she replied, her voice a little too bright. "Work's been chaotic." I nodded, hiding my smirk behind the coffee mug. "I heard Mark's taking some time off. Something about an internal audit." Her head snapped up, her eyes widening for a split second before she caught herself. "Yeah, corporate stuff. You know how it is." "Of course," I said, letting her squirm in the silence that followed. Later that day, while she was out running errands, I got a call from my lawyer. Everything was ready. The papers were filed, the financial arrangements secured, and the evidence I'd gathered meticulously organized. But I wasn't ready to serve her just yet. First, I needed to deliver a different kind of blow. That afternoon, I dropped off a package at her office. Inside was a folder containing copies of the text messages, photos, and recordings I collected. I didn't include everything, just enough to make it clear that I knew everything. The folder came with a simple note. "Jessica, you want to come clean before it's too late. John." I made sure the package was delivered directly to her desk, timed perfectly for when I knew she'd be alone in her office. Then I waited. She came home that evening, her face pale and drawn. She didn't say anything at first, just dropped her purse on the counter and poured herself a glass of wine. "Long day?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Her hand shook slightly as she lifted the glass to her lips. "Yeah," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I set my book down and looked at her. Really looked at her. "Anything you want to talk about?" For a moment, I thought she might break. Her lips parted, her eyes darting toward mine, but then she shook her head. "No, it's just work stuff." "Right," I said, standing. "Well, let me know if you change your mind." I left her sitting there, staring into her glass of wine like it might hold the answer she was too scared to give. Upstairs, I checked the camera feed from the living room. She sat there for over an hour, her phone in her hand, typing and deleting messages. To Mark? To herself? I didn't know, and I didn't care. The next morning, I woke up early and made breakfast, acting like everything was normal. Jessica barely touched her food, her eyes darting to me every few seconds like she was waiting for the other shoe to drop. "Something on your mind?" I asked, keeping my tone light. She shook her head. "No, just stressed about work." I nodded, suppressing a smile. "Well, let me know if there's anything I can do to help." She didn't respond, just stared at her plate like it might swallow her whole. By Sunday evening, I got the email I'd been expecting from Mark. "You think you're clever, don't you? Stay out of my life, or you'll regret it." I laughed, forwarding it straight to Stella, who responded almost immediately. "Looks like Mark is realizing the consequences of his actions. Thanks for the update." Jessica spent most of Sunday in her studio, pretending to work on some art project she hadn't touched in months. I could feel the unease radiating off her, but she still hadn't cracked. Part of me almost admired her resolve. Almost. That night, as we lay in bed, I finally spoke. "Jess, is there something you need to tell me?" She froze, her back to me. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice tight. "I don't know," I said casually. "You've just seemed off lately, like there's something you're hiding." She turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral. "No, everything's fine. Just work stress." I stared at her for a long moment, letting the silence stretch. Then I smiled. "Okay, just let me know if you need to talk." She nodded, turning away again. But I could tell she wasn't sleeping. Her breathing was too shallow, her body too tense. By the next morning, I could see the walls closing in on her. Jessica thought she was playing me, but she didn't realize she was already caught in my web. And the best part? The real storm was still coming. Monday morning came, and Jessica was unraveling. Her once perfect composure was fraying at the edges, her movements jittery and unsure. She avoided eye contact, rushing through her routine like a shadow of herself. I sat at the breakfast table, sipping my coffee, silently watching her. "You're leaving early?" I asked casually. "Yeah," she replied, not meeting my gaze. "Big day at work." "Right, the fallout from Mark's situation," I said, keeping my tone light. She froze for half a second, just enough for me to notice. "Yeah, it's a mess. Everyone's scrambling." "Well," I said, leaning back, "good luck. Let me know if you need anything." She mumbled something under her breath and was out the door before I could say another word. I waited until her car was out of the driveway before grabbing my phone. I checked the live feed from the audio recorder in her car, already synced to my phone. It picked up the faint buzz of her engine and then her voice. "Mark," she said, her voice shaking. "We need to talk." There was a pause before his voice came through, cold and clipped. "What now, Jessica? What's going on with the investigation?" she asked. "They're saying you might lose your position. Is that true?" "Do you think I have time for this right now?" he snapped. "I'm dealing with enough without you calling me every 5 minutes." "Don't you dare talk to me like that," she hissed. "You wouldn't be in this mess if you'd been more careful." He laughed bitterly. "Careful? You're the one who's been careless. Someone's on to us, Jessica. My wife knows. My partners know. Do you know what that means?" Her silence spoke volumes. "It means," he continued, "that I've got nothing left to lose. So don't think you can come crying to me to fix this." The line went dead. I sat back, a grim satisfaction washing over me. The cracks in their affair were spreading faster than I could have hoped. That evening, Jessica came home later than usual, her face pale and drawn. She didn't even try to make small talk, heading straight for the shower without so much as a hello. I let her be, knowing the silence would weigh heavier than any confrontation. When she finally emerged, wrapped in a towel, I was sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling through my phone. "Hey," I said, looking up, "everything okay?" She paused, her eyes darting to mine before she forced a smile. "Yeah, just tired." I nodded, pretending to believe her. "Well, I got some news. I booked us a weekend trip. Thought it might help you relax." Her smile faltered. "A trip? This weekend?" "Yeah," I said, feigning enthusiasm. "A little cabin in the mountains. No Wi-Fi. No distracciones. Just us." She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "That sounds nice, but I don't think I can get away right now." Work is just too crazy. I tilted my head, studying her. You sure? It might be good for us. You've seemed distant lately. Her face flushed, and she looked away. It's just bad timing, John. Maybe another weekend. I nodded slowly, as if considering her excuse. Okay, but we'll have to talk eventually, Jessica. She looked back at me sharply. Talk about what? I held her gaze, letting the weight of my words sink in. About whatever it is you've been hiding. For a moment, she didn't move. Then she forced a laugh, shaking her head. You're imagining things. Maybe, I said, lying back against the pillows. But if I'm not, you should know, secrets have a way of coming out. Her face paled again, but she said nothing, retreating to the bathroom under the pretense of drying her hair. The next morning, I checked the footage from her car. She'd made another frantic call to Mark, but he didn't answer. Her texts to him, which I could see from her cloned phone, were desperate and unhinged. Mark, we need to talk. I think John knows something. Please call me back. This is serious. He never responded. Jessica was unraveling. The cracks were becoming fissures, and as I watched her flounder, I felt no guilt, only satisfaction. She'd gambled everything on a man who couldn't care less about her. She thought she could play me, humiliate me, and get away with it. But the game was far from over. The storm I'd been brewing was about to hit, and when it did, she'd have nowhere to hide. By midweek, Jessica's demeanor shifted from tense to outright paranoid. She spent more time in her studio, her phone glued to her hand, texting furiously. She barely spoke to me at dinner, and when she did, her words felt forced, hollow. It was like watching a performer struggling to remember their lines. I let her simmer in her own discomfort, knowing the pressure would eventually force her hand. I wasn't just waiting for her to crack. I was orchestrating it. On Thursday evening, as we sat in the living room, her phone buzzed on the coffee table. She grabbed it quickly, but not before I caught a glimpse of the name. Mark D. Her thumb hovered over the screen, and I saw her hesitate. Then she silenced the notification and set the phone down, forcing a smile. Work stuff, she said as if I'd asked. I smiled back, calm and easy. You've been working so hard lately. You should take a break. Her laugh was brittle. Soon, once things settled down. Right, I said, leaning back. How's Mark doing? Haven't heard you mention him much lately. Her eyes darted to mine, wide and startled. Why do you ask? I shrugged. Just curious. He seemed so involved in everything before. Now, not so much. She laughed again, this time a little too loud. Oh, he's fine. Just keeping a low profile with everything going on at the office. I bet, I said, letting the silence stretch until she looked away. That night, as she fell into a restless sleep, I prepared the next step in my plan. I'd let her lie to my face long enough. It was time to see how she'd handle a dose of reality. Friday morning, Jessica left for work earlier than usual. She didn't bother with her usual goodbye kiss, and she didn't meet my eyes as she rushed out the door. I wasn't surprised. I'd spent the early hours of the morning texting Mark from her cloned phone, pretending to be her. The messages were simple but loaded. I think John knows. He's been acting strange, asking about you. We need to talk. Urgently. I knew Mark's ego wouldn't allow him to ignore the messages. Sure enough, he finally responded. Not over text. Meet me at our spot after work. Perfect. I didn't know where their spot was, but it didn't matter. Mark wouldn't risk anything too public, and Jessica's car tracker would lead me straight to them. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jessica texted me. Working late. Don't wait up. I smirked at the message. She had no idea I was already a step ahead. I pulled up the live feed from the tracker, watching as her car left the office and headed across town to a quiet, upscale restaurant. I parked a block away, just out of sight, and slipped inside the restaurant's bar. From the corner of the room, I spotted them in a private booth near the back. Jessica was leaned forward, her face pale and strained. Mark sat across from her, his expression hard, impatient. I ordered a drink, taking my time. This wasn't the moment for confrontation. It was the moment for observation. Jessica's voice was faint, but carried just enough for me to catch snippets of their conversation. He hasn't said anything directly, but I know he knows, she was saying. I think he's just waiting for the right moment to. I don't know, ruin us. Mark sighed, rubbing his temple. Jessica, I told you this would happen. You were supposed to handle him. Keep him distracted. I tried, she hissed. But he's not stupid, Mark. He's been acting so calm. It's like he's... Enough, Mark interrupted. You need to get ahead of this before he does something drastic. If he has proof, we're both screwed. Jessica looked down, her hands trembling. What do you expect me to do? Tell him? Beg for forgiveness. Mark leaned closer, his voice a venomous whisper. That's your mess to clean up. Just make sure you don't drag me down with you. I took a long sip of my drink, letting their words sink in. They thought they were playing damage control, but they didn't realize the game had already shifted. I'd taken the board, the pieces, and even the rules. When Jessica and Mark left, I followed at a distance. They didn't notice me, too absorbed in their own panic. When Jessica pulled into our driveway later that night, her face was a mask of exhaustion. She slumped into the house without a word. I stayed outside for a few more minutes, gathering my thoughts. The moment of truth was approaching, and I wanted it to be perfect. When I finally walked through the door, Jessica was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She froze when she saw me, her face an unreadable mask. Hey, I said, setting my keys on the counter. How was work? She hesitated, then forced a smile. Long. You. Eventful, I said, meeting her eyes. I ran into someone today. Her smile faltered. Oh. I let the silence stretch, watching her squirm. Then I leaned forward, my voice low and deliberate. We need to talk, Jessica. Now. Her glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the floor between us. Jessica froze, staring down at the shattered glass on the floor. Her hand trembled as she reached for a towel, but she didn't make a move to clean up. Instead, she stood there, looking at me like a cornered animal. What do you mean? She stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't flinch, didn't blink. You know exactly what I mean, Jessica. She swallowed hard, her eyes darting to the counter, then the door, as if gauging her escape routes. But there was no escape. Not now. John, I raised a hand, cutting her off. Save it. I've been patient. I've given you every opportunity to come clean. But you've lied to me. Repeatedly. And now, it's time for the truth. Her face crumpled, but still, she didn't speak. The silence stretched between us, thick and suffocating. Jessica, I said, my voice low but firm. Tell me, how long has it been going on? Tears welled up in her eyes, but they didn't move me. Not this time. I don't know what you're talking about, she whispered. I laughed, cold and bitter. Don't insult me. 8 months, isn't it? That's how long you've been screwing Mark. Her eyes snapped to mine, wide with shock. For a moment, I thought she might deny it again, but then something in her broke. She let out a shaky breath, her shoulders slumping. How did I know? I snapped. Because I'm not as stupid as you think I am. I've seen the texts, Jessica. I've heard the calls. I've watched you lie to my face over and over again while you played house with your boss. Her face crumpled, and she reached for me, her hands trembling. John, please, it's not what you think. I stepped back, out of her reach. Don't you dare try to justify this. I gave you everything, Jessica. 14 years of my life. And this is how you repay me. Tears streamed down her face now, and her voice cracked as she spoke. I was lonely, John. You were always so busy with work, and I felt invisible. Mark made me feel special. I didn't mean for it to go this far. Stop, I roared, slamming my hand down on the counter. Don't you dare blame me for this. I was working to give you the life you wanted, Jessica. To give us both the life we wanted. And you threw it all away for what? Some sleazy affair with a man who doesn't give a damn about you. She flinched at my words, but I didn't care. My anger was a storm. Years of pain and betrayal erupting all at once. Do you know what he said about you? I continued, my voice laced with venom. He called you careless. A liability. He told you to fix your mess so it wouldn't drag him down. That's how much you mean to him, Jessica. Her sobs grew louder, her hands covering her face. I'm sorry, she whispered over and over again. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't cut it. I said, my voice cold. Not after what you've done. Not after the lies, the betrayal. You don't get to apologize and pretend like this didn't happen. She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. Well, what are you going to do? I stared at her, my chest heaving with the force of my emotions. I wanted to scream, to throw something, to make her feel even a fraction of the pain she'd caused me. But instead, I smiled, a calm, deliberate smile that made her flinch. You'll see, I said softly. Soon enough. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing in the kitchen, surrounded by shattered glass and broken promises. Upstairs, I closed the door to the spare room where I'd been sleeping for weeks. My hands trembled as I grabbed my phone, opening the email from my lawyer. Everything was ready. The divorce papers, the financial agreements, the evidence. Tomorrow, I'd deliver it all. To Jessica, to Mark, to their firm, and then I'd watch them burn. The next morning, I woke early, the weight of everything pressing down on me like a lead blanket. Jessica had left for work without a word, her absence a fitting symbol of what our marriage had become. Empty, hollow, and filled with lies. On the kitchen counter, I left a copy of the divorce papers in a neat, manila envelope. Attached to it was a note written in my calmest hand. Jessica, I'm done. I won't let you manipulate me or our life any longer. Consider this the start of your new beginning. John. But that was just the beginning. By noon, I was parked outside Mark's office building. My investigator had done his job well. Every skeleton in Mark's closet was now meticulously cataloged and ready to be unleashed. I wasn't interested in simply humiliating him. I wanted to dismantle the life he'd so arrogantly flaunted. Inside the building, I handed the envelope marked urgent for the partners to the receptionist. Please make sure the managing partners see this immediately, I said with a polite but firm tone. She nodded, oblivious to the bomb I'd just delivered. That envelope contained everything. Details of Mark's affair with Jessica, proof of his embezzlement, and corroborating evidence of several questionable transactions he'd tried to bury. There was no escaping the fallout. As I left the building, my phone buzzed. A text from Jessica. We need to talk. Please come home early. I smiled, but there was no warmth in it. The house was no longer my home, and Jessica's pleas were just noise now. By the time I returned to the house, Jessica was waiting. She was seated at the kitchen table, the divorce papers spread out in front of her. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. You're really doing this, she said, her voice trembling. I stood in the doorway, arms crossed. Yes, Jessica, I'm really doing this. She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. John, I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But we can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. I laughed, cold and sharp. Start over? After everything you've done? Jessica, I've been watching you lie to me for months. Listening to you sneak around with Mark, making a fool out of me. Do you really think there's anything left to fix? She opened her mouth to argue, but I raised a hand to stop her. Don't. You don't get to make this about redemption. You chose this, Jessica. You chose him. Now you get to live with the consequences. Her face crumpled, and she buried her head in her hands, sobbing. For a fleeting moment, I felt the stirrings of pity, but then I remembered the texts, the laughter, the way she'd looked at Mark as if he were her entire world. That pity evaporated like smoke. By the way, I said, my tone cutting. You might want to check in with Mark. I don't think his day is going very well. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with alarm. Well, what do you mean? I leaned against the counter, watching her squirm. Let's just say I had a little chat with his firm and his wife. And now, everyone knows exactly what kind of man he is. Her face went white as realization dawned. You didn't. Oh, I did, I said, my voice icy. Mark's career is over. His marriage is over. And yours? It's right behind them. She stood abruptly, knocking over her chair. Why would you do this? She screamed, her voice raw. Why destroy everything? I stepped closer, my voice low and steady. Because you destroyed everything first, Jessica. You tore apart the life we built together for a man who doesn't even care about you. You played with fire, and now you're surprised you got burned? Her breath hitched, and and she staggered back, clutching the edge of the table for support. "I loved you," she whispered, her voice broken. "I still love you." I shook my head, the finality of it cutting through the air like a blade. "No, Jessica. You love the idea of me. But love isn't what you've been doing for the past 8 months. Love doesn't look like this." For a moment, the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then, slowly, I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, shattered. That evening, I packed the last of my things and left the house for good. The divorce proceedings would take time, but emotionally, I was already free. Jessica had underestimated me, underestimated what I was willing to do to reclaim my dignity. And as I drove away, a quiet, unexpected peace settled over me. I wasn't just leaving behind the betrayal and the pain. I was leaving behind a version of myself I no longer recognized. Jessica and Mark thought they could rewrite the rules. But in the end, they learned the hard way. You don't play games with someone who's already won. The house felt eerily silent as I drove away, the weight of years spent there lifting off my shoulders. For the first time in months, I felt the stirrings of something unfamiliar, relief. Jessica had chosen her path, and now she would walk it alone. But the fallout was just beginning. 2 days later, I got the first call from Stella. I'd expected it, though I wasn't entirely sure what she'd say. "John." Her voice was cool but tinged with something I couldn't place, gratitude maybe. "I just wanted to thank you for everything you sent over. Mark's out of the house, and I've started speaking with a divorce lawyer." "I'm sorry you had to find out like this," I said, though I wasn't. "Not really." "Don't be," she replied sharply. "You gave me the truth. That's more than he ever did." There was a pause, then "If you need anything during all this, let me know." People like them? They don't deserve the lives they've built on lies. Her words stayed with me long after the call ended. People like them. By the end of the week, the consequences of my actions were rippling outward. Mark's firm had wasted no time in announcing his termination, citing gross misconduct and violations of company policy. The details weren't public, but the whispers were damning. Embezzlement. Affairs. A scandal that left his reputation in tatters. Jessica, meanwhile, had been summoned to HR for a meeting of her own. I didn't need to be there to imagine the humiliation on her face as she tried to explain her way out of the mess. From what my investigator had told me, she wasn't fired outright. She resigned, quietly, to avoid further scrutiny. But it wasn't just her job she was losing. The day the divorce papers were officially served, Jessica showed up at my temporary apartment unannounced. Her face was pale, her hair disheveled. Nothing like the confident, composed woman I'd married. "John," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, can we talk?" I didn't invite her in. I simply stood in the doorway, arms crossed. "Talk about what, Jessica?" Her eyes filled with tears, but this time, they didn't move me. "I know I made mistakes. I know I hurt you. But this," she gestured vaguely, as if encompassing everything that had happened. "This isn't who we are. We can fix this. We can find our way back." I shook my head, the bitterness in my chest hardening into resolve. "No, Jessica. You burned the bridge between us the moment you decided I wasn't enough for you. This isn't something you can fix." "But I love you," she cried, her voice breaking. "I've always loved you." I let out a bitter laugh, stepping back. "If that's what love looks like to you, I want no part of it." She reached for me, but I stepped out of her grasp. "John, please. Don't do this. We can start over. We can be better." I stared at her for a long moment, then said the words I'd been holding back for weeks. "You already made your choice, Jessica, and now I've made mine." I closed the door on her sobs, her pleas, her lies, and I didn't look back. In the weeks that followed, the fallout continued to spread. Friends who had once admired Jessica turned cold, their loyalty shifting as the truth came out. Mutual friends picked sides, and though I never asked them to, many chose mine. Jessica, for all her charm and beauty, was now seen for what she truly was, an opportunist who'd gambled everything and lost. Mark wasn't faring much better. Stella filed for divorce within days of receiving the evidence, and by the time the dust settled, he was living in a dingy apartment on the other side of town. The whispers about him grew louder. And the man who once held himself as untouchable was now the subject of mockery and disdain. As for me, I moved forward, slowly but deliberately. The divorce finalized without much of a fight. Jessica had no leverage, not after everything I'd uncovered. I kept the house, though I had no intention of living there again. It was just another reminder of a life I was leaving behind. One day, I received a message from Stella. "It's done. He's out of my life for good. Drinks on me if you ever feel like celebrating." I smiled at the offer, though I never took her up on it. Some chapters don't need revisiting, even in celebration. In the end, I didn't just survive the betrayal, I rose from it. Jessica thought she could rewrite the story of our life, but she underestimated me. She underestimated what a man can do when he's pushed too far, when his heart is broken, and his dignity stripped away. And as I stood on the edge of my new beginning, I realized something. This wasn't the end of my story. It was just the start of a better one. Without her. What are your thoughts on my story? Let me know in the comments what you think about my choice and how you might have dealt with it.